Again, I'm excited about today's post-election cannabis insight conversation that we're going to talk about. My name is Cory Parnell. I'll be hosting this webinar today, and I'm excited to have our two guests from Marijuana Policy Project. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. First, we have Karen O'Keefe, and then we have Matt Schweich. And I apologize. But anyway, Karen and Matt, if you guys would take a minute and give a little bit about your background, how long you've been with Marijuana Policy Project, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Karen O'Keefe. I direct the state legislative department at the Marijuana Policy Project. I've been with MPP since 2003, so I've had the pleasure of working alongside a ton of advocates, businesses, lawmakers to dismantle the war on cannabis state by state by state. I'm an attorney, so before coming to MPP, I did some criminal defense and saw just how appallingly cannabis laws destroyed people's lives and how unequally enforced they were. So it's a real pleasure to have been able to work to stop people from getting arrested, incarcerated, and to create this new industry. Matt?
Hi, my name is Matt Schweich. I'm the Executive Director of the Marijuana Policy Project. I originally joined to run ballot initiative campaigns. I've helped run campaigns in Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Utah, Montana, and South Dakota, amongst others. I joined MPP 10 years ago, coming up on a decade, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody. Thank you, Cory.
Yeah, and then just for the audience, today, a couple things, house cleaning, but one is this is an interactive webinar. So if you have questions, please submit them and we'll address them as we go. Or if it's something that we'll be talking a little later, I'll probably defer it till that time. And the other item is we will be recording this and send this out to everyone that signed up for registration. So if you're not able to stay for the whole thing, you will get the recording. And if you choose to listen to it again, it'll be great. So really, we just got through another election cycle, and again, a lot of movement, both in the presidential seat as well as the House and Senate. And I guess what are we expecting or seeing out of with the change of the Republicans in relationship to cannabis with the president, the House and Senate? Karen and Matt, how do you guys see the landscape unfolding here for us?
Well, I can kick it off and I'll let Karen add any thoughts she has. I think we're at an exciting moment for federal cannabis reform. Whenever one party controls the presidency in the House and the Senate, that's when policy making can actually be done in Washington. And while it's the Republican Party that controls these seats of power, we have a president for the first time in modern history who endorsed legalization on the campaign trail. President-elect Trump endorsed the Florida campaign, and that's a major milestone. We've never had that before. Now, we also know at the same time that many of the Republicans in the Senate and the House are traditionally socially conservative, might not be on board, but we've also seen how President-elect Trump has changed the trajectory of the Republican Party. And so I've for a long time described myself as a federal cannabis reform pessimist, and I have a 100% track record. But now I'm an optimist, putting aside our feelings and thoughts on everything else. If you look specifically at the prospects for federal cannabis reform, I think that they're encouraging. We need to give it a really strong shot early next year, and that work is already beginning and needs to move quickly. But we need to take our shot at a Washington, D.C. controlled by one party where functional policymaking in theory can take place, and give it our best effort and try to make inroads with people that traditionally might not have been on our side, and make the most of this opportunity. So that's where I see things federally and at the state level. I guess we'll get into that later. So Karen, please add anything you've got on the federal side.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's worth noting that the current Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has not been a supporter of cannabis legalization. During the previous control, when the Democrats had control, they twice passed the MORE Act, which was legalization. The leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, has put in the COA Act, which would be legalization. We haven't seen any senators on the Republican side that have put in these bills, but this is the first time ever that we've had a president who supports legalization. And so I'm also more optimistic than I've been before, despite the challenges. And if he decides to really make this a major push, I think we could see a lot of progress.
I have two other things to add on this. I think, you know, President-elect Trump during his last administration did push through criminal justice reform that, you know, 10 years earlier, nobody would have thought the Republican Party would get behind. And we saw him, I think, shift the Republican Party in a different direction on that issue. And that issue is quite similar to ours. So there's some precedent for President-elect Trump bringing his party with him on an issue like this. And then the other aspect here is that I think President-elect Trump has made no secret of his desire to really dismantle the coalition of voters that have typically supported the Democratic Party. And indeed, he made serious inroads with non-white voters in a way that hasn't been seen for a long time with Republican candidates. And seizing upon, if I were advising President Trump, and you can see by my sign here that I never would, but if I were, I would say cannabis legalization is an excellent issue to make further inroads with young voters, non-white voters, and continue your work of dismantling that coalition. Again, I say all this with strictly my MPP cannabis reform hat on. We're looking narrowly at cannabis here. But if we do that, we see that there are a number of indicators that this could be the time for major change to the federal reform. I wouldn't necessarily bet on it, but I think the odds are stronger than they've been throughout my time at MPP over the last 10 years.
Yeah, quick question from one of the listeners. I have this idea is to go capital DOGE to support legalization. It will reduce costs for federal and state enforcement. You enable increase of tax revenue. What do you say to that?
I think that's an interesting angle. And one thing that's worth noting is Elon Musk, who contributed, I heard, $250 million to electing Trump and who's a very close advisor, was himself personally impacted by federal cannabis prohibition too. He smoked a joint on Joe Rogan's podcast back in 2018. And because, you know, he's a federal contractor, he was drug tested randomly for 2 years after that. So both from the personal impact side and governmental waste, it's certainly something that should be on their radar.
I have a very important correction, Karen. He smoked a blunt with Joe Rogan.
Oh, thank you.
Fact check.
Keeping me honest.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, there's so many, I'll call it big balls in the air for President Trump, for him to get, you know, additional time and energy behind this. Any thoughts in relationship to that? With everything that's going on between the tariff, the immigration, I mean, war in foreign countries and so forth.
There are definitely a lot of other priorities, but this is more broadly popular than any of them, I think. There is 70% popular support, 68% in the most recent Gallup poll for legalization of cannabis use. And when it comes to kind of the states' rights, letting the states have their own policy, it's even greater. The vast majority of states have some kind of cannabis law that departs from federal law. So it's really something that's popular, which isn't necessarily the case with a lot of the other issues, that it's so broadly popular.
Yeah. And one of the things that came up when we're talking about doing this webinar, a little bit to my surprise, there was a conversation around the Attorney General's role in this whole thing. And can you guys elaborate how you feel the Attorney General can influence this historically, how they've influenced it? And then going forward, how they'll influence this as well.
Well, I kicked that off, and Karen might have things to add, but the historical role of the office of the Attorney General is, that person's desire, inclination to actually enforce federal law. And so there have been memos, the Cole memos, most well known, that indicated, the Attorney General is not going to prosecute cases under federal law if state-run programs abide by certain, have certain parameters in place. And when President-elect Trump was elected the first time, named Jeff Sessions, who rescinded the Cole memo, and it caused a great deal of alarm, but actually led to no problems. And the other component of this is, over the years, Congress has barred the Department of Justice from using federal funds to prosecute certain types of cases, which created this really crazy and ludicrous situation where Congress was saying simultaneously, Department of Justice, you can't enforce the laws that we refuse to change, which never made any sense, but was good, in terms of the outcomes of allowing states to create their own programs. It really shouldn't be the case that the Attorney General is using their discretion as to which types of federal laws they enforce and how they enforce them under what conditions in this manner. Of course, there's prosecutorial discretion always with any prosecutor anywhere. But to have these types of strange restrictions placed, either imposed or self-imposed on the Department of Justice never made any sense. So the ideal scenario is one in which federal law is changed and the Attorney General is enforcing that law in line with what statute says. So we've kind of, for the last 10, 15 years, we've been in this kind of nonsensical situation with, we're at the edge of our seat. What's the Attorney General going to say? Well, it shouldn't matter because federal law should be clear and it should be changed. So hopefully, we're out of that era where we have to worry about what the Attorney General, how they decide to do their job. It should already be spelled out. But if we don't see federal reform move forward for whatever reason, then we will have our eye on the Attorney General, because that's kind of the precedent that's been set. So those are my thoughts there. But Karen, feel free to correct or elaborate.
Yeah, just to elaborate. So the Attorney General used to, 20 years ago or so, 10 years ago, prosecute a lot of people for cannabis offenses. When I started working on this issue, there were people that had dispensaries operating in California that were sometimes raided, sometimes prosecuted from the Department of Justice. That was the policy at the time. Under the Obama administration, they rolled back the prosecutions, but there were people in Montana that I know and California that were still prosecuted for what they thought was state legal medical cannabis activity. So that is absolutely crucial. While they should change federal law too, in the interim, it is really important. And right now, there is no Cole memo. In 2013, under the Obama administration, they wrote a memo, the Department of Justice, saying essentially, we're not going to target people unless these 8 priorities are implicated for cannabis violations. And under the first Trump administration, Jeff Sessions rescinded that memo. Now, in practice, we didn't see prosecutions, but we did see his West Virginia U.S. attorney say, yeah, we might still prosecute banks, we might still prosecute companies. And for that reason, implementation of medical cannabis stalled for years until Biden was president. So it is really, really important that they have a new Cole memo. It won't be Cole, that was the name of the deputy AG at the time, and that they have non-interference. It could say even that you could have, cross-border sales. It could be better than the original Cole memo, and certainly the AG could put their bully pulpit, put their support behind broader reform. And we're also, although we're not seeing people usually prosecuted for possession of cannabis and things like that at the federal level, there are some people that own guns that are still being prosecuted for being cannabis consumers, not while they're using the gun, but just for being a cannabis consumer. And you can face up to 10 years in prison for that. And the current DOJ is arguing in appeals that that's okay, that is not unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. So I'd also like to see the new AG reverse course on that, so that people don't face 10 years in prison if they're a hunter who's also a cannabis consumer.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be interesting once the AG is comes in to play, what the initial initiatives will be, and then over the first 12 months. There is a question. It kind of goes back to back to the President Trump. The question, do you think Musk and RFK Jr.'s pro stance on psychedelics has an impact on the cannabis reform? And I'm not familiar with that. I have to be honest myself.
My guess is their stance on cannabis reform will have more of an effect on cannabis reform than their stance on psychedelics. And I know, I'm not sure that Musk has really made any public statements on it other than the fact that he himself was impacted by it. I believe RFK said a number of things that indicated he was supportive. So hopefully they'll champion the issue and help move it forward. Matt?
Yeah.
I think the more normalization there is of psychedelic reform and psychedelic therapy, it can only help change attitudes on our issue. If you just take the average voter, if they become comfortable with the idea of psilocybin therapy, for example, it's going to be hard for that same person to think that cannabis should be illegal and people should be locked up for it. Those two things just don't logically go together. Our society's been taught a ranking of how bad drugs are. And that ranking, frankly, is very flawed when it comes to alcohol and cannabis. Alcohol, I think, is clearly the worst drug for the individual and for society. I call alcohol a harder drug than cannabis. But when you go through the rest of those rankings, it's not entirely unreasonable to think that, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, or LSD is a stronger, drug than cannabis. It is. So it's almost that societal ranking of the seriousness of drugs has been an impediment when comparing to alcohol, or we've had a hurdle we've had to make the case on that, but it could be helpful on the flip side. If psychedelic reform can advance, I think it pulls us along with it.
Yeah. I have just a couple. One person, any insights as to Pam Bondi's attitude towards cannabis reform or the current rescheduling process? Rescheduling is kind of a can of worms lately.
I haven't seen anything specific from her. I know that she was, I believe, the Attorney General of Florida during some medical cannabis developments there when the governor at the time tried to ban smoked cannabis, and I believe she defended his position. Kim Rivers is the CEO of Trulieve, and I saw that she tweeted that she thought that Bondi was a great pick and that she would be good on it. So I hope she's correct, but I don't have a lot more insights.
Yeah, kind of getting back to the Attorney General, any idea about when that person would be appointed? Any feeling for that?
I believe there was talk of doing recess appointments, which would have been pretty troubling in terms of our democracy. I haven't seen that kind of get much attention. So I think it's, in the first month or two after the inauguration. I believe the Attorney General is one of the first that they get to in terms of Senate confirmation of cabinet heads. So, but I'd have to Google how quickly it happened last time. But I recall that AGs are pretty quick out the gate. Pretty important job. So
I just Googled it for Sessions. He was sworn in February 9th, it looks like. So if it was the same speed, it would be a few weeks maybe.
Okay. Yeah. So that's kind of at the federal level with the Trump. Here I know in Minnesota, where I'm based, we have a new existing governor, but we have a different House and Senate. It's a lot closer than what it had been in the past. But looking at, for example, the state of Florida, where I've read anywhere Trulieve spent from 130 to 150 million on trying to get that to pass. What lessons can we learn from the Florida ballot initiative?
Well, I'll first say, I think the first thing to say about Florida is they had 56% of the vote, right? And in 55.9% of the vote. In any other state, that's a victory. In any other state, that's a resounding victory. When I started 10 years ago, we were thrilled with 54% in Massachusetts in 2016. That was a a great win. I think it was 54 in Michigan. Maine was very close. But, let's acknowledge that they earned a very clear, strong majority of voters. But the problem is Florida is the only state that requires 60% to pass an initiative. And that's just a really tough hurdle. So any conversation about the defeat in Florida needs to start with an acknowledgement that a clear and solid majority of Floridians supported this policy. I think the lesson is that for future initiatives, recreational legalization initiatives, we really have to be mindful of guarding what I call the green flank, and getting ahead of the attack that Initiative X is about enriching an existing industry. It's not a fair attack. It was not a fair attack on the Florida initiative because the initiative allowed the legislature to create more licenses. There were restrictions in terms of how the initiative could be drafted in Florida. So I don't think it was a fair attack at all against the Florida initiative, but it was an attack that was made nonetheless. And I think that, for people like us that are watching this webinar talking about cannabis, we have well-formed views on this issue. But the voters that decide ballot initiatives don't. They don't think much about cannabis legalization. They might in a couple of weeks leading up to the election. And when they hear, points about big marijuana, or this is a corporate attempt, it's easy for them to fall victim to that attack. So I think this was a lesson from Arkansas 2022 and is a lesson I learned back in Maine in 2016, where I had all the tight jeans wearing hipsters in Portland, Maine, saying that we were corporate legalization. And we were like, no, actually caregivers wrote this bill, and we made efforts to win them back. But it was only a small lesson then. I think it's growing in importance, is that you've got to get ahead of that attack, that this is, a big marijuana corporatist attempt at legalization, and point out the opportunities there might be for new operators. So I think the Florida campaign, again, earning 56% of support, they did a good job. And I lost a campaign on election day, so I feel sympathy. There's always things you can do better. And I think if you were going to rerun the Florida campaign, you would have, you'd put some resources into emphasizing that new licenses can be created, talking about entrepreneurial opportunities, putting front and center advocates, groups with credibility, saying this is a good form of legalization. And that's what you might do differently in Florida. But I think even if you did all that perfectly and you had another $50 million, you still might not have reached 60%, because that's how hard 60% is as a threshold for a ballot initiative anywhere in the country on any issue. Unless it's like, do you like dogs? That's easy to hit 60%. But if you're trying to make a substantive change in public policy, 60% is tough, really, really tough.
Yeah, I guess I'd never really thought about that. Karen, what do you think?
I agree. Just two other points I'd chime in, that there was a ton of money put into the opposition from state coffers, allegedly, from money that was supposed to be used for things like opioid treatment fund and things like that. So that was a factor. Again, 60% is a really high hurdle, but we usually don't see anywhere near as much money put in. And some of the arguments by the opposition were a little very disingenuous. First of all, it made it sound like it was a monopoly when there are 40 licensees in Florida, which is not a monopoly, it's 40, and there could be more. And also, they said, this doesn't allow home grow, which of course is already not allowed, and the people that were putting out those ads would oppose home grow. And one other thing that was kind of an opening for an attack in the measure that could have maybe been avoided is that the existing law amended the medical cannabis law that said that you couldn't, that it didn't include protections for public use. And they didn't change that so that it was the same for adult use consumers. And that was a big part of the opposition, was the claim that there'd be a constitutional right to smoke in public. And there's a lot of people that are kind of on the fence that can be swayed by that argument.
Yeah. And they, kind of staying at the state level, what are particular states that you think will lead the way going forward in 2025 and forward on the reform, or on cannabis reforms?
Sure, I'll kick it off. So at the state legislative level, Hawaii is the state I'm most excited about. It is the only state left that has a Democratic House, Senate, and governor, and the leaders are all supportive. Governor's been supportive. That Senate passed bills twice before. Last year, the House, for the first time ever, not only had committee hearings on it, which it hadn't done, but it got through 3 committees. This year, there's a new Speaker of the House. The previous speaker got ousted by a pro-cannabis advocate. She didn't become the new speaker, but the new speaker is supportive. There will be new committee assignments, so it's going to take hustle, but I feel pretty good that Hawaii should be able to get it done and get us to 25 legalization states. Pennsylvania is another state to watch. I suspect it won't actually pass into law next year, but hopefully we'll see some progress. The House has a 1-seat majority for the Democrats out of 202 seats, or 203. And the House Majority Leader said that they want to bring the bill to a vote. So hopefully we'll make some momentum and progress there. Well, we've also been working for quite some time in New Hampshire and in Louisiana, building groundwork. Those will definitely be longer term, partly because the person who won the governorship in New Hampshire is a prohibitionist. But we got through last year the House and the Senate, but they couldn't agree on the details. And those were both Republican controlled states. So that was chambers. So that was the first time ever that we had a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and the governor was Republican support legalization. They just had different ideas about how to do it. So it is doable. We just, it takes time. Those are the ones I'd say for legalization that are the best prospects. For medical cannabis, there's a bunch of possibilities that I wouldn't put my money on all of them passing, but I think, there's a real chance that one or more could. In Wisconsin, the Senate president used to be the sponsor of medical cannabis legislation. She recently the Speaker of the House put in a bill last year. He supported a bill that was ridiculously restrictive, and the Senate wasn't okay with that. So she wants to have conversations with him about if they can have a compromise that's actually workable. The governor supports even legalization. So Wisconsin's a possibility. There's a brand new Republican governor, Mike Brown in Indiana, who thinks medical cannabis, it's time to do it. He's okay with it. So Indiana's a possibility, although sometimes these things take time. And then North and South Carolina are both states where the Senate has passed medical cannabis. The House has not given it a floor vote in either state. In both states, either the governor's supportive or I don't think it'll be a problem. So those are other possibilities. And in North Carolina, the previous speaker had said, we'll only call a vote if there's a majority in the Republican caucus. And now there's a new speaker. So hopefully that new speaker won't have the same position, or we'll have movement within the Republican caucus.
So I can cover the ballot initiative front. Just a reminder, there's 2 ways to pass a law at the state level: through a legislature or at the ballot. And the ballot initiative process played a huge role in getting this movement off the ground, getting our first several wins at the state level. The important thing to know is that 24 states have a ballot initiative process. And in terms of the quote unquote low-hanging fruit, those were blue states with an initiative process. All of them have now legalized. There are no easy recreational legalization victories through the ballot at this point. We've only got tough or very tough fights ahead of us there, which I think means we really need to be economical with how we put our resources to use. And so for that reason, I don't think it makes sense to do a recreational legalization ballot initiative anywhere in 2026. The playbook for us has been put these on the ballot in presidential years. You've got an electorate that is more inclined to support this, more young voters. And I think that's particularly true in red and purple states, which are the only ones left for us to do initiatives in. So when you combine the tougher political terrain we're operating in on the ballot initiative front, and also the need to use scarce resources efficiently, and the fact it's been harder and harder for us to raise money for these initiatives. For those reasons, I don't think it makes sense to pursue recreational at the ballot in 2026. I do think that there are some very strong opportunities for 2028 when we're back in a presidential election. So that's the recreational side. I think we need to hold our horses until 2028 for a recreational ballot initiative. On the medical side, we could, if we had the resources, probably win in at least 3 states. Medical is an absolute winner at the ballot, and even deep red states like Idaho, Wyoming, these are states where we could pass a medical law in 2026. So at MPP, our hope is that we can pull together one 2026 medical cannabis ballot initiative campaign. But in order to do that, we're going to need allies within those states. And so what we're doing and will continue to do is look for those allies, see where we can bring together some resources and make sure we've got what we need to actually run a strong campaign all the way to its conclusion. I think one lesson I've learned over the past several years is don't launch a ballot initiative campaign unless you really have the funds, not just for the signature drive, but for the whole campaign. So my hope is that at least one state will present itself as an opportunity where we've got in-state partners, some in-state funding. And the good news is that if we can put that together, run a successful signature drive, and get on the ballot, once we're on the ballot, we're in a very strong position to win, because medical cannabis access is overwhelmingly popular everywhere in the country. But it's important that we have the resources, to win. I think we need to get out of the habit of losing. I say that as a 2024 loser myself. I'm allowed to say that. I ran the campaign here in South Dakota. We lost. We were an underfunded campaign. Same thing happened in 2022. We really need to make sure at this point that when we go in on a ballot initiative that we've got what it takes to win. And that goes back to the scarce resources. We as a movement can no longer afford to just run campaigns where we might win. We have to run campaigns where we will win. And so if you take that mindset, that's why you rule out 2026 legalization initiatives. And that's why you only do medical if you've got a strong in-state partners and the resources to see it all the way through. But my hope is that at least one state we can do that. If I had to pick, I think Idaho would be a great opportunity. It's a state that's evolving. There's a good in-state patient advocate group. And so that's a state I have my eye on. But if Wyoming is the state that actually presents the opportunities, we'll pursue that. So it remains to be seen. But my hope is that we can have a win in 26. We've had a win at the ballot every election cycle since 2012. 2012, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, even 24 in Nebraska. We've always gotten one win, whether it's medical or rec, at every election cycle consecutively. I'd like to continue that streak. I think it's important for reform movements to avoid stagnation. And if we go 4 years without a ballot initiative, when it's not the end of the world, but it feels like stagnation. Of course, we have the legislative opportunities that Karen's pursuing. But my hope is we can put one medical win on the board in 26, which will hopefully continue momentum and set us up for even greater success in 2028.
Yeah, one of the listeners asked, and this comes to my home state, Minnesota, which, again, I think they've taken a playbook from the state of New York versus the state of Ohio, because Ohio and Minnesota passed adult recreational at the same time. And I know that we have clients that operate in the state of Ohio and it's up and running. And have you guys heard much in regards to the state of Minnesota? The question is if you have any predictions about how it's going to end up, because I don't know if you've heard, there was applicants, there was a big denial, there was a lawsuit. Now they're basically saying we're just going to go with applicants' new timeline, including social equity. There's not going to be this head start that they were trying to give social equity holders. So I don't know if you guys have heard any more or in regards to the state of Minnesota, but that's what I've been reading recently and hearing, talking to others involved at the state of Minnesota level. If you've heard anything in regards of licenses will be issued and the program will start.
The legislative states, the pressure's all on Karen here.
So
relax.
I've seen just what you've seen. I haven't had a chance to delve into quickly. I know there's some great advocates that are very, very involved in the state of Minnesota. My understanding is that they had litigation and they decided to have all the licenses issued at the same time, essentially from a lottery, and that that'll push back the launch somewhat, but that it avoids the possibility of very drawn out litigation. And unfortunately, we've seen that in some states. In Alabama, they passed medical cannabis, I want to say back in 2021, and they have a merit-based licensing system, and it's still being litigated. They haven't even had final licensing issued or to start up and running. So it's always a challenge. There are a lot of states that have seen litigation. Usually we see less drawn out litigation when we have lotteries or free market licensing. Yeah, I don't know if we've seen any litigation on the free market licensing. But the merit-based tends to have really drawn out litigation. And in Minnesota, they had this pre-approval and people were challenging because they were kicked out because there were a lot of applications that were very similar. And the state said that they weren't legitimate, or the court ruled that.
Yeah, I think I read one where they, the Office of Cannabis felt there was an individual or group tied to 200 applications. And that, so I'm going to keep moving. There's a question. What are your thoughts on if we'll see in 2025 hemp versus marijuana, any opportunity that they can work together?
Can I just jump back quickly to
Yep,
the previous
absolutely.
topic, which I think is a really important topic and it's something that's evolved over my time at MPP, which is how do you do licensing in a way that gives opportunities to communities that have been most adversely impacted by our war on drugs. And the mindset for many years was create 20 licenses, only 20, and make sure a certain number of them go to people that fit that description. And the thinking was they're going to be 20, there's only going to be 20 licenses and they're all going to be very valuable. So by giving 5 of them to a certain class of people, we're doing a good thing. And the desire there, the motivation is a noble one. But in practice, we've just seen all this litigation, controversy, and I just think the best way to achieve equity in the cannabis industry is low barriers to entry, so that you don't need millions of dollars to hire a bunch of lawyers to get your license and defend your license. And, if we could have more smaller operators with lower barriers to entry, that would be the best way to give opportunities to people. But on that point, you don't want to go too far down that path because then you end up with with unlicensed operators or barely licensed and stores all over the place. But I think we've tilted too far towards one end of the spectrum over the years. It's time to look more at a responsible but low barriers to entry as a means to actually achieve equity, as opposed to, very well-intentioned but ultimately complicated and litigation susceptible licensing schemes. So I think that's a lesson but that's not a set thing. There's still a lot of debate over that, and I doubt Karen would co-sign everything I just said, which speaks to this being a complicated issue. But I think low barriers to entry is an important point to think about when we think about how to have equity and a representative industry.
Yeah, and I know. I mean, we initially tried just a lot of consulting in the state of New York with the state of New York and the challenges there, just because of the lack of ability to get banking, the access to capital, the ability to secure a lease, the knowledge of running even a dispensary. Those are a lot of significant hurdles that they face, a lot of social equity. And I think the first state that we remember working with social equity is out of Illinois when they came out with their social equity program. So yeah, it's a very challenging subject, and I don't think anybody from our side, we haven't seen anybody any state that's been successful so far and really rolling out a program that it's been good for all the participants. So kind of back to the question was about, can marijuana and hemp, can they work together, move in the movement going forward?
I suspect there will always be some conflict between some that are in the cannabis industry and some in, especially that want to allow hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids. The state that's been the most interesting here, I'd say, would be Minnesota, which some people are probably familiar with, where the legislature, when it had a Republican majority in one chamber, it kind of sneakily legalized, the Democrats did, the whole legislature did, but the Republicans claimed they didn't know about it. Hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids that I think were Delta 9 before they legalized cannabis as a whole. So you can get, cannabis infused, THC infused beverages. I don't think it allows flower. I think it's edibles and drinkables at bars, which in some ways is so much more permissive than any cannabis legalization law. Like, I live in Michigan, I lived in California. You can't go to a bar and get a cannabis drink instead, but you can do that for hemp-derived ones in Minnesota and in Louisiana, which doesn't have legalization at all. So I think that's a fascinating approach to it that some states have done. I think most likely in this coming year, we're going to see some states kind of roll back what they have. And there's a question of if the Farm Act will roll back what's allowed as well, assuming it's reenacted, which they need to do soon. But in Texas, for example, the lieutenant governor, who's extremely powerful, wants to ban hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids, which are being sold at said VFWs, I believe I heard in the state, and there's a really strong push from veterans against that. In Hawaii, last year's bill included bringing hemp under the same regulatory authority as cannabis and having some additional rules. We saw a similar approach in Maryland. Well, I know the drafter is going to work to accommodate the concerns of the hemp industry. I imagine there will be some people that don't love some of the changes. And there is a lot of concern about the novel cannabinoids that are synthetically derived.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I know in Minnesota, it's amazing once that law got passed, the number of products that actually I saw where it came out of California, out of Colorado, and again, it's a big gray area on gummy THC products here in the state of Minnesota. But and again, what does that look like once the program gets rolled out across the state? One thing I want to make sure that we touch on, and I've seen 3 questions about it already, is the rescheduling. Just touching base on that and kind of where it's at, and then any insight that we might have on that.
So, as everybody probably knows, under the Biden administration, the DEA, FDA, and HHS all recommended rescheduling cannabis. 40,000 comments were submitted, including from us, that supported either rescheduling or descheduling. Hearings were scheduled to begin on December 2nd with some selected witnesses, they had to be adversely affected by the proposal. So it's mostly people that are prohibitionists. And there are going to be hearings on them, I want to say from February to March is the current schedule. And there's some litigation about people that were excluded and other litigation related to that. Trump has said that he supports rescheduling, so he won't try to put the brakes on it. There's some thinking that some within the DEA, even though they're the proponents, might not actually be pushing for this. And there's some concern about that. And certainly prohibitionists have been saying that they're going to try to slow it down or derail it. And there's a real possibility that they could litigate also at the point that the hearings are done and it's finalized. So, we've got support. Obviously, cannabis should not be a Schedule 1 drug. It should not be alongside things that don't have medical value. 6 million Americans or so use it through medical cannabis programs. Tens of thousands of healthcare practitioners recommend it. Tons of studies show that it's beneficial, but you have this weird situation where the type of large-scale clinical trials that you would need for FDA approval were made impossible by the federal government because you could only use federal cannabis for a long time and they wouldn't approve studies. They'd take forever and make you redo them. But there is plenty of research, and there are also other countries that have allowed it nationwide, like Canada and Israel, and that have research. So it should be rescheduled. I'm hopeful it'll be rescheduled, but certainly the prohibitionists will be doing what they can to try to slow things down.
I think it's just, look, we're believers in incremental progress, right? So this is a good thing. We've always operated that way as an organization. But I just have to point out, we had a Democratic president at the start of his term with control of the House and Senate, with very overwhelming support within the party, and I think even back then close to majority support among all American voters for legalization. And what do we have to show for it? A rescheduling to Schedule III that says cannabis is more dangerous than Xanax. I mean, this is an epic squandering of a political reform opportunity by the Democratic Party. I mean, to walk away from 4 years in power, total or partial, with only a Schedule III rescheduling to show for it is it's kind of it's damning that's all that they can show. The Democratic Party had an opportunity and completely failed to realize its potential. And worse, even worse, they've now handed it on a platter to the other party. So political strategy perspective, it's frankly unforgivable, in my opinion, that Schedule III rescheduling is all that this Democratic administration can point to.
I saw a comment that somebody asked about if Biden supported legalization, and he did not ever support legalization. He should have. He said he supported decriminalization. He didn't think people should go to jail for possession. But even that very small thing, it's still a federal crime. It's not being prosecuted, but every single one of the 50 million plus cannabis consumers in this country is still a federal criminal. And that has lots of real world impacts, from gun rights to if you live in HUD housing, to if you're not a US citizen, but you're legally in the country, you might, if you admit to it, not be able to come back. And they didn't even put in a bill to decriminalize it. The COA Act that Schumer put in didn't ever get a vote in the Senate. So it is a real disappointment that he both had such a narrow position of what he supported compared to where the public was, and that he didn't move on it. All he did was propose rescheduling and have some pardons just for possession.
Why pardon somebody for a crime if you think the crime should stay a crime? I don't understand the logic of that. I'm gonna pardon someone, but I'm gonna keep the law in place that put them there. Unless there's really unique circumstances to a case, that just doesn't make any sense. And that's what President Biden did. Look, I pardoned some people. Why aren't you trying to change the underlying law that put those people in that unjust position in the first place? So it's very frustrating looking back at these 4 years, and how the Democratic Party, they didn't run with the football. They tripped over their feet after 1 yard.
Yeah, I would say definitely the rescheduling is so important to the whole industry, just to get that completed from an income tax perspective. It's a game changer for all of our clients and all the operators throughout the U.S. So it'll be interesting to watch it. Just talking to a variety of people, some feel that the testimonial is stacked against it moving forward. Have you guys, when you're looking at the people that are testifying, do you get that feeling, or do you feel it's a level playing field at this time, or no opinion?
My understanding is, by and large, people testifying, they found that you have to be adversely affected by the recommendation that it move from Schedule 1 to 3. So it's stacked with people that are opposed, by and large, not entirely though. The National Cannabis Industry Association will be speaking. One of MPP's board members' law firm is representing some people that are supportive that will be testifying as well. So it's not 100% stacked. And I know Doctors for Cannabis, Doctors for Drug Policy Reform is also filing to try to get to be a witness as well, because they want it to be Schedule 4 or 5 or descheduled, and thus are adversely affected by it only being Schedule 3. So that is disappointing, but I think the facts, as were outlined by HHS and FDA, are overwhelming that cannabis has no business being in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2.
Yeah, and to your point, Corey, I mean, despite my frustration, this is a good thing. It's incremental progress. It has a lot of benefits. While we're frustrated, we're still pursuing it. Karen spent a ton of time working on this, coordinating. So please don't take my frustration as apathy. We still want to see this through. It's a good thing. We might not get any federal reform from the Trump administration. This might be, an important, step forward. So we're still pursuing it, but it's also our job to try to move this movement forward. And it's, I think, fair to be a little frustrated, but rescheduling is still a good thing that we want to see end successfully.
Yeah, and again, it's I guess it just comes back to trying to move things forward. I get that, but it's so frustrating when I see and watch the Safe Banking Act not make a movement, can't get through. And I mean, something so simple as that is, do we want billions off the street through the banking system or not? And it seems like that's such an easy one that, to me, that's almost like a no-brainer. So then when we get to no scheduling and some other items like that, it's like, and Matt, this is the most optimistic I've felt you speak. So you're actually making me excited. So I appreciate that. How do we get optimistic around, not only the rescheduling, but the Safe Banking Act? How do we get that through?
Well, my take on that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of the reason safe banking didn't move is among Democrats, there was a feeling that, why should we fix this problem for the banks without fixing the other problems? Why should we, prioritize safe banking until we also have a bill that ends arrests? That basic mindset, not incremental progress. And I think with Republicans in control of Congress, that issue goes away. This desire for holistic reform, while noble, I think, is no longer a factor. And so if we don't get, a big landmark federal reform bill, I do think something like safe banking has a decent chance. I feel some optimism there. I think the approach with federal reform needs to be, we pursue the Holy Grail. We pursue Trump, getting behind a bill that solves all these problems, knowing that that's a heavy lift. And if we fail, we have fallbacks. And whoever's dialoguing with the Trump administration, if the big bill falls apart, well, at least you've got to give us a new Cole memo, and you got to get Safe Banking Act, and you need to get rescheduling done, see that through the end, the fallback position. But if you don't pursue something greater, then that's not a fallback position. But that's how I look at it. We pursue the big prize, and if we can't, well, we still stake out some other territory and get some other important reforms through. And I think the politics around safe banking are such that that's the type of one-off reform that maybe could break out and get through if we're in that kind of fallback position.
Mm-hmm. Karen, do you have any thought? Or
I agree.
I like that. Well, we're at the top of the hour. And again, just want to thank Karen and Matt. Great conversation. I really appreciate kind of your insights, your passion. There's a lot of, I don't know, I call it sand shifting in this cannabis world that we live in. So it seems like, as my partner Jim Marty told me once, is industry has the most hard lefts and hard rights, and you never know when you're hitting that hard left or hard right. So hopefully the rescheduling goes in a good way. Again, I think there's a lot of positive things behind that can also tremendously help the industry as a whole. So again, appreciate your time, and for those that were able to join, again, appreciate all the questions and the dialogue. And just want to mention that we'll be doing another webinar here shortly. It'll be a follow-up on the True Leave, and the IRS came out with a lovely little fact sheet on amended returns that we'll be doing in the near future. So again, Karen and Matt, thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cory.